Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video, although this is at my old channel or my core channel, A Tippling Philosopher, but this is an ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce, Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. YouTube is still playing silly buggers with my other channel, and so that's why I am here for this one. Right, we're going to dip into a few other sources today to look at a number of bits and pieces. First of all, we're going to go to the Ukraine the Latest podcast by the Daily Telegraph to talk about air defense systems and the provision of equipment and military assistance to Ukraine from other countries. I dipped into this, or at least I referenced it in one of my news pieces earlier. Now we're going to actually dip into the podcast. So here goes.
Great now to join Joe Barnes. Joe, it's good to have you back on. You've written a big story in today's paper about the rush to boost Ukraine's air defense as Russia prepares to unleash stockpiled missiles. You've been talking to several of your sources for this story. What have they been telling you?
Yeah, hi folks. So we often report on what we call the Ramstein meetings, to give it its full name, the Ukraine Contact Group, which is a group of around 50 or so countries, up to 54 countries in total, that are organised by the US to basically coordinate military donations to Kyiv. But what is sort of like very rare from these discussions is actually what happens within them. What is the thought process when, say, the UK and US are going, what do we need to give Ukraine next? What are the priorities? We very rarely hear that. We often hear demands from Ukraine or requests for the 4As, as they've become known: ammunition, artillery, air defence and armour. That's basically what's on the table at any one time. But so what, after a discussion I've had with a senior US official, is that basically is able to give me and everyone else a glance about what people think of Ukraine's counteroffensive and how the West is switching ahead of the winter months. And so at the last Ramstein meeting a few weeks ago, it became clear that Western governments have now placed air defense systems at the top of their priority list for future donations to Ukraine. This is because Russia, by all accounts, in Western intelligence, Ukrainian intelligence, and things we can actually see in the public domain, is going to conduct another winter of strikes against critical infrastructure, so energy and heating infrastructure, basically to freeze and starve Ukrainians. So the shift was pushed by Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, at the recent meeting. And this US official told me, air defense, air defense, air defense, that is going to be the key focus for all allies that are providing security assistance. And the source went on to add, Russia are big fans of starving and freezing Ukrainians to death. So,
I mean, this is a change in approach. It's all been about sort of tanks more recently and mechanized equipment, at long distance munitions and ammunition for rocket launchers and whatnot. Now there is this move back to air defense. We saw that as a previous objective for assistance, as a previous priority. And as I explained this morning, that was a priority because Ukraine was getting hit, energy infrastructure was being hit, but that's not so much the case anymore. And they were provided enough air defense equipment to sort that problem out. So then assistance and other countries aiding Ukraine moved on to aiding the counteroffensive, and now Russia are having success in hitting other elements of Ukraine with their cruise missiles and Shahed drones. So it's a case of going back to the drawing board to look at what the needs are.
So British military intelligence believes Russia is stockpiling in preparation for a systematic campaign. And that would lead to the suggestion why the West are sort of pivoting away from donations that could help the counteroffensive. So artillery ammunition, so the 155mm shells, potentially new tanks, new armoured vehicles, new landmine clearing equipment, because they think essentially when the rains come, the winter months come, Ukraine's counteroffensive is going to be bogged down and the war is going to enter a new phase of can Ukraine survive a long-range campaign? So, and then my source went on to say they, as in Ukraine, are thinking long and hard about how to use the capabilities they have, but we do want to try and move more air defence into Ukraine in the weeks and months ahead. So Krylo Budanov, the Major General in charge of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, has recently warned that he was braced for another attempt by Moscow to plunge the country into cold and dark as the temperatures drop. He said that his agency were looking at a deterrence and retaliation strategy to counter that sort of attack, which Western leaders have always described as war crimes. Kyiv has accused Moscow of a campaign of energy terror. So last winter, for instance, half of Ukraine's energy system was damaged, which at times left millions without heating and electricity, which from my sort of reporting in the country last November, you could really tell that was starting to weigh on people's minds. There were secretive plans to evacuate Kyiv in case of that failing, the infrastructure failing. So it's a
I mean, that was, it was a big problem. And you could make an argument that actually Russia took their foot off that. They didn't quite go hard enough on it. And then you could do a counter argument that might be because the Ukrainians had managed to get into place in good enough time decent air defenses to stop the Russians from doing that. But the Russians didn't quite hammer the energy infrastructure enough that it crippled Ukraine. Ukraine did an amazing job of getting it back on, back to a functioning position, the energy infrastructure, and that was pretty incredible. So, lots of arguments to be had about that, and of course the war crimes element with regard to both the energy infrastructure and the food exporting infrastructure. Such that, the attacks by Russia are affecting world food supplies.
Real big issue. And last week, Ukraine's power grid operator announced the first mass strikes on energy infrastructure in nearly 6 months. So that basically is the start of the campaign that we're expecting. The argument here is not that...
It's also interesting that Ukraine have, it's nothing really compared to what the Russians have done, but last night there was drone attack on electricity substations within Russia. So there is an element of Ukraine trying to just have a little probe here and there or create issues for Russia here and there, but it's not nearly as widespread as the Russian sort of waves of drones and missiles that have been aimed at energy infrastructure within Ukraine.
Western officials doubt Ukraine's ability to go forward and go ahead with the counteroffensive even in the winter months. It's actually, they now believe that Ukraine has almost stretched its air defense capabilities because it's forced to protect not only cities from sort of these attacks, not only power plants, not only sort of the interconnectors, the power cables and transformers. It's also had to now think about grain shipment infrastructure. We've noted and reported extensively on the strikes.
And that's what I was reporting earlier. You could argue it's fairly sound strategy from Russia, which is concentrate on energy infrastructure. Ukraine then rushes in air defenses to protect energy infrastructure and civilian targets as well. So they were hitting civilian targets. And then while all those high value air defense systems like Patriots are put in place, and NASAMS and SAMP-T and IRIS-T and whatever, all those systems are put in place, then Russia just switches and hits grain infrastructure for which there's no protection. Odessa had pretty much got off scot-free, like comparatively speaking, and certainly the Danube River had not, as far as I know, had not been hit significantly before. So Russia, I wonder whether it's intentional, had got Ukraine to put all their air defenses in particular places and then hit where those air defenses weren't. And then Ukraine is forced to say, okay, we need even more air defenses, because it's not like they won't hit these other things that we're now protecting. So we can't rob Peter to pay Paul. We can't take away from a power plant over there to protect the grain port in, Ismail. What we need to do is have more air defense systems. Now, this is why you're also seeing a move, and in fact, I'll be, I think, reporting on this tomorrow. There's a move to build air defense systems within Ukraine. I think this might be part of what Zelensky's been talking about, maybe some Frankensams, but B, what manufacturers like BAE Systems and probably Rheinmetall, and I don't know who else, but why they are going to be investing in I mean, why they're investing in Ukraine is obviously to make money, but I imagine they might well be starting by building air defense systems. So, this is at the top of everyone's agenda.
Maybe on the Danube or in Odessa. And then we've also got Ukraine has a wider sort of front line to defend as well with air defense equipment. So that is why the West is now saying, look, you know what, we need to change our sort of aim and get as much of this stuff as we can in. What's interesting is lots of countries have said, look, we can't give you any air defense systems. We don't have enough to protect ourselves. But suddenly a lot of people are coming forward and saying, look, we've got more to give. We've managed to look. We can dig a bit deeper. We can help out. So
that's one of those things where you have air defense systems in place in your own country for fear of being attacked, obviously, by air. But when you look at the reality of global politics, you're thinking, well, so say you're Britain, for example. You're like, okay, who's going to attack us? Right, it's going to be the Russians. I mean, no one from Europe's going to attack Britain. And China would have to, get an awful long way to come and attack us by air, so on and so forth. So it's going to be Russia, but then they have to pass over the either the Baltics or the Nordic states. And so therefore, we can rely on at least some protection from allied nations. So perhaps, and I'm not saying the UK has done this, but you can imagine a situation where some nations are like, well, normally in normal times we would be like, these are ring fence for protecting our own skies, but actually the threat is Russia. And the Russia are at the moment not a threat because they are barely able to prevail against, they're not able to prevail against Ukraine. And so therefore, especially if that's going to be the main threat to us going forward, then actually let's give some of those air defense systems to Ukraine so that actually they do the firing at them at Russian airframes such that we don't have to fire at them because they won't be able to attack us because they've been degraded by Ukraine. So you might get this situation where a number of nations are going, well, actually, we can spare them now. I mean, ideally, we wouldn't spare them. But strategically, Russia are the only game in town. And so, yeah, Ukraine, have them.
So hopefully this is going to end in Ukraine being able to add to its already complex air defense network, which consists of old Soviet-era tech, and then the more sort of Western high-tech units, batteries as we like to call them, such as the Patriot system, or whether it be the German IRST, the Italian, French SAMP-T system. So yeah, that's one thing I think we're going to look forward to in the next weeks and months, as my source told me, and I'll stop there.
So that's what's going on. So I thought that was really important to dip into. I'm actually going to go now. I'm going to skip what I was going to do. I'm going to go to tanks because it's sort of tangentially connected, which is, okay, what is being produced, what are the needs? So now we're going to actually go to Russia and say, what are the needs? I talked this morning about how T-90Ms being seen more in the loss statistics tell a story, and how they're probably getting low on tanks and they're using other types of tanks because they've kind of cycled through older variants of tanks, so on and so forth. And one of my viewers, Potato Gunman, was saying, well, you have these losses, you claim it's because they're running out. These losses claim they're running out. These losses claim they're running out. So you can't have it all. But actually, I've never said that. So I've never said that you see T-62s being destroyed and T-55s. It means that you're running out of tanks. Well, I have said refurbishing them means that you need tanks, right? That you're running low on tanks. If you had plenty of tanks, you wouldn't need to be going into your storages and refurbishing really old tanks. So there are elements of different variants of tanks telling us different stories. One of the things that I talked about this morning was a T-90, but there's also the idea that more T-80s are also being seen as well, and this tells us something. And T-72s are being degraded because we're seeing fewer T-72s, and they aren't going to be making T-72s. This does tell us a story. So let's look into this. So Richard Vereka, who I think is part of War Spotting, who is the equivalent to Oryx says, a short thread with all my tanks graphs, having just updated all of them. First, the overall one. T90s have shot up this month, which is something I'd said, and you can see that the amount of T90s in September is a much greater proportion of what is being lost. And my theory was, well, that tells you that they've lost a lot of tanks, because previously in the war they weren't featuring, they weren't using these tanks so much because they had loads of T72s, a bunch of T80s, maybe some older T60s or T64s and whatever. So they were using them, and it looked like they were keeping their T90s back. They didn't actually have that. They don't have that many T90s. T90Ms, the most latest variant, they only had like 100. And recently, as you can see by this green proportion of the graph there, we have seen more T90s get lost. And this tells us a couple of things. Or it might tell us, one, they're making more, and we're going to come on to that. And it also tells us that they're using more of them because they have lost their kind of bog standard tanks that they would generally use, being attrited away. So they've been cautious, I think, with T90s, and now they're forced to use them more. So I said that is an indication that tank numbers have degraded sufficiently for the Russians to be forced to do that. And I stand by that. I think that's correct. And T80s have continued their 4-month decline. So there's a decline in T80s, which is interesting. T72s, steady-ish. T64 and T62 and 55s remain a tiny fraction. Data tables will be at the end. So what I think has happened with the older tanks like the T55, 62s, T64s is that Russia have been forced to bring them out of storage and refurbish them. But what they probably haven't done is say, right, we refurbish these tanks, so these are going to be the tanks we're going to send our experienced tank crews into fights with. Like, yeah, we've got these out of storage. I'll tell you what, put away those T72s and T80s, take these ones and go in with them. No. So I think what these tanks are doing is fulfilling duties further behind the line, maybe indirect fire, maybe whatever they're doing, maybe training, so on and so forth. And the Russians are sending the tanks in that are better tanks, and they're not that suicidal that they say, we've refurbished these crap ones, go and use them, mate. You'd be like, yeah, but what about that? No. So that's what I think the fact that they're refurbishing them still denotes the idea that they are running out of tanks. Data tables will be at the end, he says. So what I'm going to do now is go on to another graph of his. He says, one way we can be confident losses are higher than visually confirmed, e.g. Russia had 180 T80U variants, 89 are confirmed loss, but the variant has now disappeared. So what happened to the other 91? So, right, where am I going here? Right, if we look at this graph of T80 tanks, they are losing a huge amount of T80 BVs. These aren't the T80 BVMs, are the better tank. Those have been somewhat consistent, but the T80Us, which are the older, crappier ones, aren't being lost as much. They appear to have been largely lost, and so we are seeing many more T80 BVs, but these aren't. I believe, I'm no expert, but I believe there's quite a big difference between the BV and the BVM. So why are they using a lot of these not quite so good T80s, and why are there a lot more of them? Okay. Then we got Osint Uri here saying Russian T80 BVM tanks are seen on a train leaving the Omsk Transport Machine Factory, tank factory at Omsk in Russia. These are not new tanks, but refurbished T80s that were taken out of storage. At this moment, there is no identification that any new tanks are being built. This leads me to believe that Russia is nowhere near being able to produce 1,500 new tanks per year, and were promised by Shoigu and the Russian Security Council earlier this month. Instead, it is estimated that Omsk Transmash is refurbishing about 10 tanks per month, 120 per year, or enough to equip one tank company per month. And meanwhile, Ukraine is destroying 30 to 40 Russian tanks in a week. Even if Shoigu was referring to a mix of new and refurbished or modernized tanks, the outlook is dismal. Now, I don't know whether his claims that they're making T80 BVMs en masse at the moment, or at least a large amount of them compared to other tanks is necessarily correct. We're going to drop into Perun's absolutely brilliant video. Check out all his videos. His one, not from this last Saturday, but the Saturday before, talks a lot about this. I could play you the whole video, but actually I've just picked out this segment.
In this war, when Russia has good equipment, we've seen them use it. So if
in other words, sorry to interrupt already, but that goes back to the point I was making, that they're not, that yes, they have these T-55s, but they're not necessarily using them front. They are going to use their better equipment, if push comes to shove.
those are the stats from early 2022. What are we seeing now in September 2023? Starting with the Russian tank fleet, what you're looking at here is visually confirmed loss data from War Spotting, which is a visually confirmed loss database, an analogue to Oryx, if you will, albeit with slightly stricter acceptance standards around individual losses, and which, critically for this analysis, attempts to attach a date of a loss to each individual recorded vehicle. And what I've done here is clumped together several months at a time of loss data in order to smooth things out somewhat, and split those Russian tank losses by type. And what it shows is pretty dramatic. At the start of the war, 71% of Russian tank losses were some type of T-72. In the most recent period, that number had decreased to 36%. The share of losses made up of older stuff, like 55, 62s and 64s, has roughly doubled from the earliest part of the war. But the real story...
So, just before we goes on to the real story, those older tanks go from 3% up to 9%, 11%, 13%. So they did start using them a little bit, and they did start attriting them. And then more recently, it's popped down to 6%, still more than at the beginning of the war. So they are using more of those older refurbished tanks, but they're probably not throwing them into the frontline battles.
Story here is the rising importance of the T-80 series, which has gone from being less than a quarter of losses between February and July 2022 to more than 50% between May and August 2023. That would suggest that as a lot of T-72s are being lost or new units are put together, they're not being replaced by other T-72s, they're being replaced by T-80s. And that can't be the result of new production from scratch, because Russia hasn't produced a new T-80 hull since 1991. Now, as to why the T-80 is taking over, there's lots of potential theories out there and very few definitive answers. It could be a genuine tactical preference for some reason. The T-80 was the blingy tank of the Soviet era, and critically, unlike T-72 and T-90, it can reverse faster than a walking infantryman. Like seriously, T-72 and T-90 do something like 5 kilometers an hour in reverse from memory, which is, I imagine, a bit slower than most tank crews would like to be able to move if they spot something that is about to try and kill them. It could be that even though there are far more T-72s that are meant to be in storage than there are T-80s, the T-80s are in better condition, or there's more capacity to restore them, and as a result they're getting put into action first. There's many theories available and precious little evidence applicable, so I'll try and avoid speculation. But there is one thing I'm pretty confident saying about the T-80s that are being brought into service. Overwhelmingly, they are not new production or ultra-modernised models. What I've done here is split...
So this is where I think he basically disagrees with this claim. Although there might have been a train of T-80 BVMs, it's unlikely that that more modern variant of the T-80s is what they are currently producing, larger amounts of.
Split up T-80 losses by their subclasses over those same time brackets. The T-80 BVMs at the top there, those are the modern and up-to-date ones. First revealed in 2017, it's got a lot of the bling you'd expect from an upgrade package of that era. It included enhanced relic explosive reactive armour and the Sosna U gunner sight. That's the one that reportedly included a French thermal imager, if you've forgotten. T-80U, by comparison, doesn't have any of that bling and is the middling option. This is a 1980s model that also got some new guided missiles in the very early 1990s, but one of the key points with the U model was the improved protection, which was better, it must be said, than the T-80BV model. And the BV in turn was better than the absolute cash converters version of modern T-80s, the T-80B from the late 1970s. If given a choice, I can't imagine any sane Russian tanker choosing a T-80B or BV over the BVM. There might be places it's cool to be a little bit retro, but it's probably not the battlefield. And yet, what we're seeing here is that in February to April 2022, the T-80Bs and BVs accounted for less than a quarter of T-80 losses, and in recent months, it's more than 80%. At the same time, the share of losses made up of T-80 BVM has basically held the same through most of the war. while it's the T-80Us, those tanks in the middle, that have more or less gone extinct. What that data seems to suggest to me is that there are T-80s going through modernisation to BVM standard. That's enabling the model to maintain its share of the overall fleet despite suffering losses.
So in other words, this idea that coming out of Omsk Transmash is a trainload of BVMs is correct. That's obviously what has happened. And that is enough. That is enough to give a consistent amount of those tanks. That means that their losses have stayed fairly consistent across time.
Meanwhile, with no new T-80Us being produced or converted, the type is going extinct, while most of the T-80s we are now seeing in Russian service are most likely vehicles pulled from storage, the older models, the Bs and the BVs, that they are reactivating and sending into service without waiting for BVM standard modification.
So in other words, they are refurbishing T-80s and they are refurbishing some to BVM standard. There are some getting through, but the large proportion of them, because that's what's being reflected in what's being lost at the front line. And he talked previously, and we joined him after he'd done the analysis that shows what you lose on the front line is reflective of what you have, obviously, and what you're producing.
That suggests a need to make up heavy losses quickly and a bottleneck around upgrade capacity. But just because we're seeing a lot of reactivated garbage doesn't mean we're not also seeing some new production. In terms of new Russian tank production, the focus isn't on T-14 Armata, it's on T-90M. Deliveries of the M model have only been going on for a couple of years at this point, but you can see evidence of them happening on screen there. In the early...
Right, and this then goes back to the idea that T-90Ms, or T-90 tanks are taking up a larger proportion of the losses and have done, as you can see from sort of November onwards, give or take a couple of months where it's less so, and now considerably more.
Stage of the war, most T-90s that were being lost were older models. T-90As. Cut to May-August 2023, and the T-90As seem to have magically disappeared, and we're overwhelmingly now looking at T-90Ms. So while I think the evidence suggests that Russia is producing nowhere near as many T-90Ms as some commentators claim, they are producing them, and we are seeing them. Now, just in case tank losses represented some sort of anomaly...
So we'll leave him there because he goes on to talk about infantry fighting vehicles and other stuff. So, but... as ever, really great stuff and well worth looking into. So here's the idea that they are producing vehicles, of various types. But we can get a sense of what they're producing. Some T-80 BVMs, which is a fairly decent T-80 or the best T-80 variants, but more of the lower class B and BV T-80 variants, and some T-90s, but he goes on to conclude right at the end, the overall conclusion is they're not producing enough because they can't produce enough in relation to their loss statistics, where they are just losing so many tanks every single day, every week and every month. So that what we see in the loss data does tell a story. Okay. Right, I'm going to leave what I was going to go through with you for tomorrow's extra. I'm just going to leave you with this. Sometimes you need a bit of downtime, right? Here we have a Ukrainian unit doing some artistic interpretation, where we have a famous painting being interpreted here by the soldiers. I think that's pretty cool. Nice to see them being a little bit creative. And they've even included a pet dog and whatnot. So I think that's pretty cool. Anyway, thank you so much for supporting the channel. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate the community over the last couple of days where I've been, I've been honestly really frustrated and not too pleased with YouTube, and it's been a little bit stressful. But I thought we might have turned a corner as one video was accepted this morning, and then it just went straight back to just outright. My mapping video, I took out all the data. It was just the title, the video, and it's just me talking about maps. I even changed war to conflict, and took nothing in the description, and they still restricted it. So I'm like, okay, whatever. So that will be ongoing, I presume. Anyway, thank you. Take care. Speak soon. Till the pips.